They thought it was just an abandoned puppya, fragile creature found by a little girl beneath the pines. But as the vet held it under the clinic lights, something didn't add up. Eyes too wide, limbs too long. And when the DNA test came back, the truth shattered everything. What do you do when the thing you've come to love doesn't belong in your world? Whispers of Wild Hollow. The fog hung low over Elk Ridge, Colorado, that morning, draping the evergreens in a veil of silver stillness. The town, cradled between mountain ridges and stitched together by narrow gravel roads, hadn't quite stirred from sleep when the clinic bell chimed unexpectedly. Dr. Jonathan Hayes, hunched over a steaming mug of black coffee and an untouched medical chart, looked up as the door creaked open. In stepped a girl, no older than 12, with tangled blonde curls and a denim jacket 2 sizes too big. She clutched something wrapped in a plaid scarf, something shivering. "I found him by the river trail," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind outside. "He was cold, alone." Jonathan stood slowly, heart already tightening with instinct. He motioned her in, gently peeling back the scarf to reveal a trembling creature, bones sharp beneath its skin, eyes glassy with exhaustion. For a second, he didn't breathe. It looked like a poop almost, but not quite. The fog settled thick over Elk Ridge, Colorado, clinging to pine needles and rusted mailbox flags, blanketing the mountain town in a heavy stillness. The sun had yet to break through the gray sky, and the winding roads that carved through the forest were slick with dew. It was the kind of morning where sound moved slowly and breath came out like ghosts. Inside the modest brick building that housed the Elk Ridge Veterinary Clinic, Dr. Jonathan Hayes stood alone in the front office, stirring a lukewarm cup of coffee as he read over surgical notes from the day before. He was a man in his early 50s, with dark blonde hair graying around the temples, a square jaw lined by a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes a pale blue that always looked a little tired. Since the death of his son 3 years ago, drowning accident during a summer lake trip, Jonathan had become quieter, more inward, speaking when needed but rarely more. He wore his grief like the wool cardigan on his shoulders, worn, constant, and no longer remarked upon. The clinic was silent, save for the low hum of the incubator in the back and the occasional groan of the furnace struggling to wake. Then, the front bell jingled, a rare sound at that hour. Jonathan turned, surprised, and saw a small figure push through the door. She was maybe 12, wearing a faded red hoodie, rain boots splattered with mud, and an oversized denim jacket that looked borrowed from someone taller. Her blonde hair was tangled, escaping from a hasty braid. She held something close to her chest, wrapped in a checkered scarf. It moved faintly in her arms. The girl hesitated near the doorway, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Are you Dr. Hayes?" she asked softly. "I am," Jonathan replied, already stepping forward. "Come in. What do you have there?" She peeled the scarf back carefully. Inside was a bundle of shaking limbs and dull ice, a creature soaked through and caked in half-frozen mud. Its ribs showed clearly beneath nearly hairless skin, and its breathing was shallow, chest rising and falling like paper in the wind. "I found him under a tree by Miller's River Trail," the girl said. "He was just lying there, whimpering." Jonathan nodded, his hands already moving. "What's your name?" "Abby. Abby Palmer." Jonathan recognized the last namer, mother, Rachel Palmer, worked part-time at the town post office. Abby resembled her. Thin frame, sharp chin, and freckles sprinkled across her nose like cinnamon. He motioned her toward the exam table. "Okay, Abby, let's get a better look." As Abby carefully set the creature down, Jonathan called toward the hallway. "Maggie, I need you in here." A moment later, Maggie Rivers, his assistant, entered, tugging on a fleece vest over her scrubs. In her early 40s, Maggie was sturdy, auburn-haired, and practical in both temperament and movement. Years of working rescue calls and emergency care had given her a no-nonsense tone, but she carried a quiet compassion in how she touched each animal. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the patient. "Oh, what in the world is that?" "That's what we're going to find out," Jonathan murmured. Under the overhead light, the creature didn't look any more like a typical puppy. Its eyes were wide-set and glassy, with an odd golden hue. Its limbs were long and spindly, its muzzle slightly too narrow. The pads on its paws were unusually small, and its ears, while still soft and rounded from youth, sat at a strange angle. Jonathan ran his fingers gently down its spine. Cold, dehydrated, starving, but not broken. "I think it's just a pup," Maggie said uncertainly. "Maybe a weird mix? You know how folks are with backyard breeding?" "Maybe," Jonathan said, though he didn't sound convinced. Abby hovered beside the table, watching everything. Her eyes were wide, worried. "Is he going to be okay?" "We're going to do everything we can," Jonathan promised, his voice steady. They warmed blankets and filled a heating pad beneath the creature. Maggie prepped fluids, and Jonathan checked vitals. The temperature was dangerously low, but heart rate, though rapid, was steady. Jonathan inserted a pediatric 4 with practiced hands, the creature barely twitching in response. As he cradled it in his arms, swaddled in fleece, he felt an unexpected pang deep in his chest. The weight of the small life against him fragile, trusting stirred something he hadn't felt in a long time. A memory rose unbidden, the weight of his son, Thomas, asleep in his arms after a night terror. The warmth, the tiny hand gripping his shirt collar. Jonathan blinked hard and focused on the present. "Let's keep it overnight. Fluids, warmth, rest. See how he looks by morning," he said. Maggie nodded. "I'll set up the incubator. You'll call the wildlife office if it turns out this isn't a dog?" "If it comes to that," Jonathan said quietly. Abby lingered at the doorway, reluctant to leave. "Can I come back tomorrow?" "Of course," Jonathan said. "You did the right thing bringing him in." The fog outside had begun to lift slightly, the outline of the pine trees growing sharper. Maggie carried the creature to the back room, while Jonathan watched Abby walk down the gravel path, her small frame disappearing into the mist. That night, long after the clinic had gone still, Jonathan sat alone beside the incubator. The creature was breathing easier now, nestled in warmth. Occasionally, it would twitch a leg kicking as if dreaming. Jonathan didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing for certain. Something about this tiny soul had cracked something open inside him, and that scared him more than anything else. 3 days had passed since the strange little creature was brought in from the woods, and while it had begun to recover, the questions surrounding its nature only deepened. The morning sun filtered weakly through the windows of Elkridge Veterinary Clinic, casting golden stripes across the worn linoleum floor. Outside, snow had begun to gather along the curbs, a quiet reminder that winter was creeping in early this year. Dr. Jonathan Hayes stood in the dimly lit exam room, arms crossed, watching the pup through the glass of the heated incubator. It had grown stronger, its breathing now steady, its movements less sluggish. But something still didn't feel right. Its fur was growing back, yes, but in irregular patches, with odd color variations from smoky gray to tawny brown. Its legs were too long, too thin, and it moved with a kind of twitchy grace he hadn't seen in domestic dogs. Every sound it made unsettled him further. There were no playful yips or soft barks like a recovering puppy might give. Instead, low whimpers and thin, high-pitched trills filled the room, noises that reminded Jonathan more of the forest at night than any kennel he'd known. "Still not eating on its own?" Maggie Rivers asked as she entered the room, holding a fresh batch of warmed formula. Her sleeves were rolled up over her flannel shirt, and a faint smudge of iodine stained her left wrist. "Only in small amounts," Jonathan replied, his voice distant. "Still refusing solid food, but hydration's holding steady. Temperature normal, reflexes strong." Maggie nodded and began preparing the syringe. "He's watching you." Jonathan turned. Sure enough, the creature's golden eyes were locked on him, alert and curious. He felt it again, that strange stirring in his chest, a pull he didn't quite understand. "He seems more alert when you're near," Maggie said. "Maybe he imprinted on you." Before Jonathan could reply, the front bell chimed. Footsteps padded quickly across the lobby, and a familiar voice called out, "Dr. Hayes." Abby Palmer peeked around the corner, her face flushed from the cold. Today she wore a knit beanie pulled low over her ears, and a red scarf trailed from her neck like a streamer in the wind. Her cheeks were pink, and snow clung to the bottoms of her jeans. Jonathan smiled gently. "Good morning, Abby. Come on back." She stepped in, eyes lighting up the moment she saw the incubator. "He's still here." "Of course," Maggie said kindly. "He's recovering, thanks to you." Abby moved to the side of the unit, kneeling to meet the creature at eye level. It perked up immediately, pressing its nose to the glass. "He remembers me," she whispered, smiling so wide her dimples showed. "He does," Jonathan said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. They sat in silence for a moment, watching as the creature mirrored Abby's movements. Then her smile faded slightly. "My mom says I shouldn't get too attached. She thinks he'll be taken away once he's better." Jonathan crouched beside her. "Your mom's being cautious. Sometimes, when we help animals that belong in the wild, we have to make sure they go where they'll be safe." Abby nodded, quiet. Then she said softly, "He makes me feel less lonely." Jonathan looked at her, startled by the vulnerability in her voice. "I mean, since the divorce. My dad moved to Oregon last year. I barely see him. At night, I just talk to this picture of our old dog, Benny. It helps. But now this little guy, he listens like Benny did." Jonathan swallowed hard, the back of his throat tightening. He knew that kind of grief all too well, the quiet kind, the kind that settled in the bones and didn't leave. "You're not alone, Abby," he said gently. "Not here." Maggie cleared her throat from behind them. "Jonathan," she said, holding up a printed photo, "you need to see this." It was a still frame from one of the clinic's motion detection cameras, placed to observe animal behavior. The creature was standing in its incubator, front legs braced against the wall, staring at the hallway light with an eerie stillness. "Look at the posture," Maggie said. "That's not how puppies stand. That's stalking posture. And those eyes, they're wide open in full light. No squinting. Dogs hate fluorescence." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same." That afternoon, after Abby left, he sat in his office surrounded by veterinary manuals and breed encyclopedias. He'd pulled up photos of rare dog breeds, Thai Ridgebacks, Basenjis, even Carolina Dogspot. None of them matched the creature's bone structure or coloration. Out of growing frustration, he finally opened his digital lab request form and filled out a submission to the regional diagnostic lab in Boulder. He carefully packed a blood sample, noting the date, symptoms, and physical oddities, then sealed the envelope. The sun had dipped low by the time he stepped out to drop it in the outgoing courier bin. The wind had picked up, tugging at the hem of his coat and whispering through the pine trees that loomed behind the clinic. Inside, the creature gave a soft, reedy howl, barely a whisper, but enough to stop Jonathan in his tracks. It wasn't a bark, not a whimper. It was the sound of something calling the forest. The courier van pulled away from the Elkridge Veterinary Clinic just as a pale winter sun crested the eastern ridge, streaking the clouds with pink and silver. Inside the clinic, the silence was interrupted only by the soft beep of the incubator monitor and the occasional shuffle of paws on fabric. Dr. Jonathan Hayes sat at his desk, sipping from a mug of now-cold coffee, his eyes scanning the computer screen for any sign of incoming lab results. He hadn't slept much. He hadn't wanted to. The creature he no longer easily referred to as a puppy in his mind had changed even more overnight. Its fur was beginning to fill in across its back and shoulders, a thick silvery gray that shimmered in certain light. Its eyes had darkened slightly, taking on the piercing intensity of something watching rather than seeking comfort. Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was aware. It was late afternoon when the phone rang. Jonathan answered immediately. The voice on the other end was steady and clear. "Dr. Hayes, this is Paula Larkin from the Rocky Mountain Regional Lab in Boulder. I'm calling about the blood sample you submitted earlier this week." Jonathan set his mug down, leaning forward. "Yes, I've been expecting your call. We ran a full panel," Paula continued, "and the results were unusual. At first, we thought there was a contamination issue. But after multiple clean runs and a second verification with our genetics team, we've identified the subject as Canis lupus, specifically a wild gray wolf. Estimated age, 6 to 7 weeks. Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. "Are you sure?" "We're absolutely certain," she said. "There are no domestic dog markers in the DNA profile. This isn't a hybrid. It's a pure wild wolf pup." He exhaled slowly, his shoulders sinking. "Thank you for the confirmation. There's one more thing," Paula added. "Given the species and your location, I've notified Dr. Laurel King at the Colorado Wildlife Field Office. She's our senior biologist and specializes in predator management and rehabilitation. She may be contacting you soon." True to form, the call came less than an hour later. "Doctor," Laurel King's voice was deep and unhurried, her tone that of someone used to speaking in emergencies without ever raising her voice. "Dr. Hayes, I understand you've been caring for a wolf pup." "Yes," Jonathan admitted, pacing slowly across the room. "We didn't know until now. He was brought in by a young girl, found alone, freezing. I thought he was a severely neglected puppy." Laurel chuckled softly, not unkindly. "It happens more often than you think, especially this time of year. Dispersed packs, early orphaning, and human misidentification. May I ask, how is the pup behaving?" Jonathan hesitated. "He's strong, alert, eats only when hand-fed, doesn't tolerate loud sounds, and he's attached to me, follows me with his eyes constantly." There was a pause on the other end. "That could complicate things, but we'll assess when I arrive. I'd like to visit tomorrow morning." When he hung up, Jonathan stood in the doorway of the exam room for a long time, just watching. The pup was curled in a tight crescent, tail tucked, ears twitching at even the faintest movement. There was nothing obviously dangerous about him. He looked peaceful, like any sleeping animal might. But Jonathan couldn't unhear the word now echoing in his mind. Wolf. As the sky outside deepened into blue, Maggie returned from her shift at the community shelter. She brought 2 fresh heating pads and a container of chicken stock from her own kitchen. "Any word?" she asked, placing the supplies on the counter. "It's not a dog," Jonathan said quietly. "It's a wolf. Confirmed." Maggie froze, eyebrows rising. "A real one?" "Yeah, full-blooded." She didn't say anything for a long moment. "That means you can't keep him, doesn't it?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "Dr. Laurel King's coming in the morning. She's with wildlife." Maggie sighed and leaned against the counter. "You okay?" He considered lying, but didn't. "I'm not sure." Night fell quickly, as it always did in the mountains. The wind picked up, rustling pine branches outside the clinic. Jonathan pulled a cot into the office for the 3rd night in a row. The pup had started whimpering if left alone too long, and though he knew he shouldn't encourage the bond, he also couldn't bear the thought of the creature shivering again in fear. At 2:13 a.m., Jonathan dreamed of his son. Thomas was standing barefoot in a sun-drenched meadow, laughing as the little gray pup chased him in circles. The boy looked back and smiled at Jonathan, eyes full of life. "It's okay, Dad," he called. "He's supposed to run." Jonathan awoke with tears drying on his cheeks, and the soft sound of the pup's breathing in the next room. He rose, walked to the incubator, and sat beside it for a long time, placing his hand gently against the glass. "I know," he whispered, "but part of me wishes he didn't have to." The morning came with a muted grayness, the kind that made the whole town of Elkridge seem as if it had paused mid-breath. Snow now dusted the pine-lined sidewalks, and the cold was sharp enough to sting any exposed skin. Inside the veterinary clinic, the warmth of the exam room stood in stark contrast, filled with the hum of machines and the quiet rhythm of breath from the small wolf curled under layers of fleece. Dr. Jonathan Hayes had been up since before dawn, checking vitals, restocking formula, wiping down surfaces that didn't need cleaning. It wasn't just Habitat was a way to hold on to something. Something steady, something within reach. At precisely 9:04 a.m., the bell above the clinic door rang, and a woman stepped in, brushing snow from her brown leather jacket. Dr. Laurel King was tall, with dark eyes framed by crow's feet that hinted at long days in the sun. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled into a low ponytail beneath a wool ranger's cap. She moved like someone who'd spent her life in the field steady, direct, unbothered by chaos. "Dr. Hayes," she said, offering a gloved hand. Jonathan nodded, shaking it. "Thanks for coming." Laurel pulled off her gloves and walked toward the back room with him, her eyes scanning everything, not judgmental, just observant. "So this is the patient?" she asked as they reached the incubator. "He's stronger," Jonathan replied. "Eating regularly, temperatures stabilized, no signs of infection or respiratory distress." Laurel crouched beside the enclosure, observing the pup with narrowed eyes. After a moment, she opened the glass door slowly and extended her hand. The little wolf stirred, sniffed the air, and pressed his nose to her finger's knot with fear, but with cautious curiosity. "He's already habituating," she said softly. "And fast." Jonathan's heart sank. Laurel stood and pulled a clipboard from her satchel. "I'll file a preliminary evaluation. You're in violation of 2 wildlife statutes, but under emergency care provisions, I have discretion." "Meaning?" Jonathan asked. "Meaning I'm not going to seize him today," she said. "But he needs to be transferred to a licensed rehabilitation center as soon as possible. And until then, he must remain completely isolated. No visitors, no public interaction. Understood?" Jonathan nodded, though his gut twisted. But the town hadn't gotten the message. By mid-afternoon, rumors had begun to buzz like flies. Someone had posted in the Elkridge Community Board online something about a wild animal at the vet's and a danger to pets. Then came the knocks. First, from concerned citizens. Then from local news. And finally, from Ranger Tom Eldridge, a stocky man in his late 40s with a thick mustache and a parka that had seen better winters. Tom had grown up in Elkridge, knew everyone, and was more comfortable around deer carcasses than conversations. But he'd been sent to assess the situation formally. "Doc," Tom said, eyes darting toward the back hallway. "I got orders to check it out. You know how folks are when they think there's a threat to their chickens." Jonathan rubbed the bridge of his nose. "He's not a threat. He's a 6-week-old pup that was nearly dead when we found him." Tom sighed. "You've always been solid, Jonathan. But this one's different. You keep him too long, you risk human imprinting, and then he can't ever go back." Jonathan looked at the floor. "Just a few more days. He's not strong enough yet." Tom hesitated. "I can give you 3. Then I have to report back to Denver." Later that evening, after the last client had left and the front lights were dimmed, the back door creaked open. Jonathan turned, expecting Maggie, but instead, he saw a small figure slipping through the hallway shadows. It was Abby. She wore a black coat that nearly swallowed her. Her knit gloves balled into fists. Her face was flushed and tear-streaked, eyes wide and red-rimmed. "I just wanted to say goodbye," she whispered. Jonathan started to speak, but her small feet had already carried her to the enclosure. The wolf pup lifted its head immediately, ears perked, then scrambled toward the door of the kennel with a soft whimper. Abby dropped to her knees, pressing her gloved hands against the metal bars. "I'll always remember you," she whispered, voice cracking. The pup licked at her fingers, nudging her hand with its nose. Abby buried her face in the crook of her elbow, shoulders trembling. Behind her, Maggie had quietly appeared, and though she said nothing, she turned away and wiped the corner of her eye with the edge of her sleeve. Jonathan let Abby stay until the pup curled back into sleep. He walked her home under the cold starlight, neither of them speaking much, their breaths steaming in the dark. That night, back at the clinic, Jonathan sat at his desk with a blank sheet of paper in front of him. He picked up a pen and wrote slowly, carefully, "Dear Thomas, I thought I had forgotten what it felt like to care. Not just to treat or to heal, but to want something to live so badly. It hurts to breathe. This little one reminded me of you. Not because he's like you, but because he woke something in me that had gone so quiet, I didn't even hear it fading." He stopped, stared at the paper, then folded it in half. Outside the window, the town was quiet. The only sound was the wind against the eaves, and from the back room, the faint, rhythmic sigh of a young wolf sleeping, unaware of the storm that waited outside his cage. The sky over Elkridge turned amber just before dawn, casting a golden sheen across the frost-silvered rooftops. The trees had already begun to shed their coats rust red, burnt orange, and brittle gold leaves blanketed the ground in soft silence. Inside the veterinary clinic, the light was dim, warm, and still, as if the walls themselves understood the weight of the day. Dr. Jonathan Hayes stood at the edge of the back room, one hand resting on the edge of the pup's enclosure. The wolf, no longer the fragile creature he once was, sat alert, his fur now full and dense, the sheen of health glowing in his gray and brown coat. His body had filled out in just a few weeks, muscles more defined, eyes sharper, more curious than before. The creature had grown into something wild. Jonathan hadn't slept. He'd spent the night preparing everything: medical records, feeding logs, dosage charts, behavior notes, all carefully organized into a folder labeled "For Transfer." His movements were quiet, measured. Inside, he was a storm. At exactly 8:58 a.m., a white truck pulled into the clinic's gravel lot, marked with the green crest of the Colorado Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, Dr. Laurel King stepped out first, now wearing a field jacket and tan canvas pants tucked into her boots. Her eyes found Jonathan's through the front window. She nodded once, briskly, then turned to the back of the truck. Two staff members followed: Aaron Mayfield, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 30s with a kind face and short-cropped chestnut hair, and Joanna Clark, a wiry woman in her late 20s with quick, analytical eyes and a calm, no-nonsense air. Both wore gloves and carried soft transport crates lined with blankets and straw. "He's ready?" Laurel asked as she stepped inside. Jonathan gave a single, steady nod. "He's healthy, eating solid food, no signs of illness." She walked to the enclosure and opened it slowly. The wolf pup stepped forward without hesitation, sniffing her hand, then casting a glance toward Jonathan. Laurel looked at him. "Would you like to help move him?" Jonathan hesitated for just a breath. Then he opened the latch, lifted the wolf into his arms, and held him there for a long, quiet moment. The creature didn't squirm. He pressed his muzzle against Jonathan's shoulder and stayed perfectly still. Aaron opened the crate, and Jonathan gently lowered the pup inside. Before sealing it, the pup looked up. Their eyes locking, man and beastan Jonathan felt the sharp, unexpected burn of tears behind his eyes. From the front of the clinic, the bell jingled. Abby Palmer burst in, her cheeks red from the wind, her coat zipped up wrong. She was panting, eyes searching. "Wait." Jonathan looked to Laurel, who stepped aside as Abby raced in and dropped to her knees in front of the crate. "Hey, little guy," she whispered, pressing her fingers gently to the metal grate. The pup's ears perked, and he pressed his nose to her hand. "I'll miss you so much." Her voice cracked, and she quickly wiped her cheek with her sleeve. "He's going to a safe place," Laurel said gently. "There's land, other wolves. He'll learn what he's meant to be." Abby sniffled. "He already is something." Everyone fell quiet at that. 10 minutes later, the truck pulled out of the lot. Abby and Jonathan stood side by side, watching the taillights disappear beyond the hill, their shadows long and quiet in the morning sun. 3 weeks passed. The clinic returned to its rhythm vaccinations, dental cleanings, holiday checkups. Winter crept in like a whisper, turning pine needles silver and sky the color of slate. Jonathan moved through his days with practiced calm, but the space in the back room always caught his eye when he passed by. One Wednesday afternoon, Maggie entered his office holding a large envelope. "It's from Laurel," she said, placing it on his desk. Jonathan opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, 6 of them. The first showed a sprawling forest enclosure, sunlit and alive. In the second, the wolf pup stood between 2 older juveniles, ears perked, posture confident. In the third, he was mid-run, legs stretched, tail raised, joy written in every line of his body. The fourth was a close-up those same golden eyes, now brighter, fierce, wild. Jonathan stared at that one the longest. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a small wooden frame, and slid the photo inside. Then he placed it beside a weathered photo of his son, Thomas, grinning under a tree in a distant summer. That night, after closing, he returned to the back room. The walls were quiet now, the incubator unplugged, folded, and stored. He placed the framed photo on a shelf near the window, sunlight catching on the glass just right. He rested his fingers against it. "Run free, little one," he said softly, "and don't look back." Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, and for a moment, it almost sounded like howling. Sometimes, the ones who need healing most are the ones who cannot speak it. A man lost in grief, a girl searching for connection, a creature born to run free. And somehow, their paths crossed not by accident, but by quiet grace. They named him nothing, and yet he became something unforgettable. Because love, even if borrowed, leaves a mark. The lesson here is that letting go doesn't mean forgetting. Sometimes, the most selfless act of love is to set something wild back where it belongs 7, if a piece of your heart goes with it. If this story touched you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment to share what it meant to you. Comb. And if you've ever had to say goodbye to a soul that changed your life, tell us below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of healing, love, and second chances. And maybe, say a quiet prayer tonight for all the wild things we learned to love.